Good afternoon and welcome back to the Workflow Automation Learning Series. My name is Mike Cohane. Today we'll be looking at webhooks, how we use webhooks in workflow automation to allow programmatic access to our workflows so we can remotely launch them. So we'll talk about what they are, how they're created, and give an example of how we might call them. Let's get started. We'll kick things off like we normally do in the Meraki dashboard in the automation section. You can see we have our workflows from our previous sessions. Let's go into the automation menu on the left. And for webhooks, we're going to start off in rules. So we click on rules and you'll see several options: automation rules, history, calendars, and webhooks. We'll begin in webhooks and the other sections we'll explain as we go. We don't have a webhook right now. So we want to create a webhook which allows external parties to call us. That means we need an entity that provides both a URL and an API access key for that programmatic access. So that's what we're going to do right now. We'll create a new webhook and we'll call this Learning Series Webhook. All right, and this is a webhook for others to call. The content that we're going to expect to be passed to anybody using this webhook is an application JSON, but there are other formats that you could choose. We'll stay with application JSON. That's all we need to do. The webhook API key and the URL are going to be generated once I click save, which we'll do right now. Okay, it was created. Let's click on it and see what we get. So here is our webhook API and our URL. We're going to use those and provide those to people who want to call us a little bit later. Okay, I have a webhook for someone to call. What I want to be able to do is create an automation rule that ties this webhook to an execution of a workflow. Now, how do I do that? So I'll hit cancel. Let's go into automation rules. I'm going to click on automation rules. We don't have one yet, so we're going to set up a rule. This rule is going to be intended for handling what happens when a webhook comes in. So there's different types of rules we could go through. In this learning series, we're talking about webhook rules. And we'll call this Learning Series Workflow Launch. Okay. And we'll put a quick description and just say Learning Series, just to have something in there. All right, good. Now we want to be able to select which webhook do I want to run when somebody calls this webhook. Sorry, not when they call. What webhook is associated with this rule? Now we only have one webhook, so that's Learning Series. Okay, we've associated the webhook with our rule. Now what do we do with it? We have a whole bunch of conditions that we could talk about where we can add criteria for when this runs, but let's keep it simple for now. Understand that there are conditions. We're simply going to choose a workflow. All right, now let's use one of the ones from our previous lessons. We'll take the JSON placeholder web service. Now that has two variables that are hard-coded in it. And when we developed our workflow, we put default values in there. Those default values are put in to our webhook rule, saying that whenever you call this rule, when we call this webhook, this workflow associated with this rule via the webhook, we're going to put those values in. Now I could map those values to something else. Let's hold off on explaining that for a minute because we want to get this concept down. For now, understand that all the variables associated with this workflow are exposed to the rule, and you have a chance to assign values to them. So this is the only chance right now we're going to be able to say what values go in them. So in this rule, the matching field will be Liam Graham, and the operation will be users. Let's just do this so you can see what happens. We're going to save that. All right, I now have an automation rule that when the webhook we created is called, this rule will be launched. And this rule will call the workflow we assign to it and pass the parameters we want it to pass. Now, how do we call it? Let's use a curl command as an example of something most people are familiar with to launch against our webhook. Let's go back in here using this API key and this webhook URL. How do we do that? All right, I'm in the terminal editor and I'm going to paste in the command. Let's just take a quick look at it. I'm doing a curl command, which is a post. My content type is application JSON. Remember, we selected that when we declared our webhook. And I'm just putting in the URL, which already has the API key defined in it. And I'm just pasting that in as the body. This should be enough for us to run. So we'll click return. All right, it ran. Now, how do we know if it ran and what it did? We go back into the automation rules and we'll look at the transaction history. So let's go over and click on history. And you can see all the executions of webhooks. You can see that somebody here has been testing something out for JSON placeholder. But here's the one we just created, July 10th. I'm going to click on that. And what we see is some good information. We not only see it ran and ran successfully, but we get the full header of what was passed. So any information that was sent to us programmatically, we can see here. And specifically, we were looking if anything else was passed in the request body. Right now, you can see nothing was passed in the body. Remember, our curl command was a post with just a URL. We didn't include a body. And I'll come back to why that's relevant in a second. Let's go see how our workflow that's associated with this rule then ran. We'll go into automation, run monitoring, and we'll find our workflow. And you can see here's the one that just ran, and it was started by our webhook rule, the Learning Series workflow launch. So that looks good. It was successfully ran. If we go into it and take a look, we can see what values were passed into our variables. We had two input variables to this workflow, and we can see indeed the variables that were coded in the rule were passed in, and the workflow ran accordingly. All right, we have a webhook. It's associated to a rule that launches a workflow, and it passes in the values of the input variables we need. What if I want to pass my own variables in? What do we do differently? Let's go back first to the curl command and let's pass in a payload to see what that looks like. Back over in our terminal, let's bring up our previous command. All right. And let's just put a body on it. And when you put a body on it with curl, if you're not already familiar, you add a -d and then you can put in, we're putting in quotes and everything because this is all part of a curl command. So we have an outer an outer brackets of a single tick, and we have the double ticks for the inner quotes for our key value pairs. So what we're saying now is I want to pass in a body that has two variable names, operation and matching field, and a value associated with them. Let's send this command. Now we'll jump back over and look at what came through in the transaction history. Okay, we'll click on history. There's our next execution, the one that just ran. We'll click on that. And if you notice, in the request body of the curl command that we sent to this webhook that was caught by this rule, here's our JSON key value pairs. All right, that's great. But this doesn't mean that those values were passed to the workflow that gets executed and associated to this rule. In fact, it doesn't. The automation rule has been set up to only pass what we tell it to pass. So if I want a workflow to be able to dynamically change parameters every time I call it, how would I do that? It's actually very easy, and it's general practice with webhooks. So let's go back to our actual workflow that we want to be able to be run through webhook calls and see what changes can we make. Okay, we're back in the automation workspace. let's take our JSON placeholder web service, find it from our earlier learning series, and we're going to duplicate that so we can make modifications and track them separately. So here we have our copy. Let's go in there, and the first thing we'll do is let's rename that. So let's call this one now JSON placeholder, and we'll call it Webhook service. All right, now we're going to try to pass this a variable payload through a webhook from our curl command. So we're not going to use the variables the way we knew them. We'll change that. So currently we have a matching field, and that's what we're doing our lookup on, our match when we do our web service call. And let's change the name of this. Let's change this to something simpler. Let's call that match. All right, and that's going to now be a local variable. Save that out. And the operation, which is also, and I'm going to change that to a capital just to make these variables. That was an input variable. I'm also going to make that local. We still need them. We're not going to change anything in our workflow, but we're not going to pass them statically, which is how webhooks do it. We're going to allow the user to pass us a JSON payload that we will parse in order to find that. So we're going to have a new input variable, which is called our webhook payload. And this is going to be passed in the body of the webhook call. And that's going to be our input variable. And that type is going to be JSON. So we have a JSON string. Technically speaking, this is required to run, so I'm going to say required. Save that. All right. Now, we know a curl is going to hit the webhook URL that we've set up, which is going to be triggering a rule that will call our webhook. So we're going to assume that, even though we haven't shown it yet, that that's going to somehow get that body to us to process. So let's go ahead and pretend that we're getting our JSON query, our JSON payload in, and we're going to have to query it and break it apart in order to see it, just like we've done in the past. So we're going to do a JSON path query, and we're going to do that on our input variable that we're passing, so our input webhook payload. And what we want to pull out of that is the $ matching. So that will be one parameter of our key value pairs, and we're going to store that in a variable called matching. And then we want to know what operation it is. So this is going to be in the $ operation. That's the query, and we'll store that in a variable called operation, also of type string. Okay, once we get that parsed out, we're just going to assign those to variables. So we're going to do a set variable. So we're going to assign our input variables to update. The first one's going to be, we're going to update our local variable called match with the result of our activity of doing a JSON path query where we get the match. And we'll do one more. We'll do the operation. So we're going to update the local variable called operation with the JSON path query operation value. So that's the payload passed in. Now, if we've done everything right here, when we pass our curl command in to a webhook that has a URL, that has a rule set up to call this workflow, we'll now just need to make sure that the payload from the curl command makes it down. So how do we do that? All right, let's get out and jump out and take a look at that. Let's start by creating a new webhook. So we will call this webhook our, web service payload. And that is going to be a webhook carrying a payload to our web service workflow. All right, application JSON looks good. When I save this, the key and URL will be generated. Let's go back in and take a quick look, and you can see here's the API key, and it's also embedded within the webhook URL right here. All right, looks good. So we have that, and now we will go back and create a rule. So in automation rules, let's create a new one. And we'll call this a webhook rule called web service payload, just so we know. This rule generates a workflow request passing in the payload to be processed as input variables. Okay. The webhook we're going to run is called web service payload. All right, good. So then we'll scroll down, and the workflow will run when this webhook is called is our JSON placeholder web service that we just modified. Now here's the interesting part. Here's our one variable that the rule knows the workflow requires to run. We're going to map it to include the request body of the curl command or the programmatic call that's coming in. Whatever format you've done it, you've passed in a request body. We're going to map that to the variable. So what we're saying now is when this workflow, when this webhook is called, we will, web service payload, we will run this rule, and this rule will call the JSON placeholder webhook service workflow. And when it does that, it will pass in the request body of the programmatic interface to that webhook, and it will pass that along into our workflow. And remember now, in our workflow, we're expecting that. We parse out the JSON and we assign it to the input variables, and we should run perfectly. So let's try that out. Let's save this. Now let's go run the curl command using this new webhook URL. All right, so I have a modified curl command. I've changed the URL that was provided in our new webhook that includes our API key, and I've changed my payload to be a match with the username Leon Graham and the operations users. This should give us back the email account of that user from the web service. That's what our earlier learning series web workflow did. So let's run that. All right, now we can go back in and see if the rule triggered when that webhook was called, and we'll check and see what it did with the workflow. Okay, we're back in our rules. Now we should see, since we called that the history, there's our web service payload. I actually ended up hitting that curl command a couple of times, so you see 3 entries in a row. But that's what happened. The curl command ran, hit the webhook triggered this rule, and in the payload you can see the JSON structure was passed. Now what we need to see is in our run monitoring, if we go into automation, go into run monitoring, and we look at, we'll do JSON and find the webhook service. Ooh, it failed. Let's see why it failed. Okay, it failed because I got a mismatch on my names. So my name should have been, I put matching instead of match. A lot of you probably noticed I did that when I was doing this, so we're going to make a quick change. It's always good to debug. And we're going to change the property names in this JSON path query. So it's going to be workflow is unlocked. And we are going to change this to match. And we'll change this to match. And I think we also made a mistake when we passed in the payload. So this is a capital M, and this will be a capital O. So let's make sure we get that correct when we pass the payload in. Otherwise, that will fail again. All right, we've made that change. Let's go back and let's, oops, says invalid. Let's validate it. Validate. All right, looks good. Now we can go back and we can run our webhook again. So we'll go back into our webhook, hit the up arrow, and let's make sure that these are capitals. Operation. Otherwise, our JSON path queries won't work. All right, that ran. If we go back in, let's go back into the workflow instead of going into run monitoring, and we look and we can see we successfully ran. Let's take a look and see if we got the correct result. The input to the workflow, the variables is, where is it? Right here. That's the payload that came in from the webhook rule, and we passed in match and operation, and then we did a JSON path query on that, copied that out and put it in the appropriate variables, and then we set the variables. So in the end, we should have an output variable that gives us our matching email address, which it does. So everything's working as we would expect. All right, we covered a lot in this lesson. We talked about webhooks being used to automate a programmatic interface into workflows. We figured out how to tie that webhook into the actual running of a workflow through a rule. Now, with webhooks, payloads are generally considered static unless you give it a specific payload. So you can send static payloads in the rule by defining them and mapping them to whatever values you want. But if you want them to be variable, you can pass in a payload, and that payload then becomes a variable that you can parse in your workflow, and you can do whatever you want with it. In our case, you saw how we parsed it, assigned it to variables, and then ran our operations. In our next lesson or a future lesson, we'll actually run these webhooks from our Meraki dashboard when there are alarms. So we'll generate alarms, and we'll use these webhooks to trigger workflows to do automation on our behalf. And look forward to showing you that then. Take care.